Hey everyone. So for this lecture, we're going to look at the short-term causes of the American Revolution. So what we're looking at here is the immediate causes, the events that led up to the colonies revolting from the British. We looked at the long-term causes, the last one, the underlying reasons for it, but these are really the causes that lead up directly to the conflict. So it's important to remember that these are real people who revolted against British rule, the colonial militias you see here. They were led by real people who had lives. Many of them were farmers and artisans, like we've learned about. But this is a story of one John Parker who fought for the British in the French and Indian War, fought against the French, and he led 77 troops against 700 British redcoats at Lexington. And he was quoted as, "Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." So he was willing to fight for the colonies, willing to leave his life and fight for them. So here's another story of a man who fought for the British in the French and Indian War. Ebenezer Mackintosh was a poor shoemaker in Boston. He said he had fought for the British, but when the British had started collecting taxes to pay off that debt, he actually led a mob of 3,000 people in an attack against tax collectors. We'll learn a little bit more about this process as we go through there. But just to think of this man who's a shoemaker leading a mob against the people collecting taxes. So now we have the story of Richard Palms. This again is a story that shows colonists going directly against the British. So what we see in all these stories of these individuals is the change, the transformation from a subject to open revolt against the British. So Richard Palms was a common man. He actually led an attack on British troops with a club in the famous Boston Massacre that you see here in this engraving. This engraving is actually from Paul Revere. But he challenged 9 armed British soldiers, and the soldiers fired into the crowd. So what you see here, you can see the British soldiers completely surrounded by a mob. But this is portrayed by the Americans through a lot of our history as the tyranny of the British. So you can see, but this is the quick change, the changing between the relationship. So as these colonies were settled, they tended to have different governments, as we learned about with the different colonies. They had different ways of life, different government set up. So, but there was ideas of trying to join the colonies together. As you see, join or die, the depiction of the snake and the different colonies cut together. One of the first plans to try to unite the colonies was the Albany Plan of Union in 1754. They tried to unite the colonies in a common defense against Indian threat, and it was a complete failure. The colonies couldn't figure out how to work together. Their different ways of lives, different values, different political systems could not come together to face that threat. So it was also, this is the end of salutary neglect from the British, to where the British had basically left the colonies to make their own laws, make their own institutions, tax themselves. The French and Indian War forced Britain to assert its control over the colonies. It had brought 10,000 British troops in the Americas throughout the colonies, and it also had created a massive debt. The 140 million pounds in debt is close to trillions of dollars of debt in today's money. So this really affected the idea. They became more assertive over the American way of life in the colonies. The French and Indian War also meant that there was westward expansion of the colonies. So with the Treaty of Paris and the end of the French and Indian War, the British gained control of all the territory you see here, which is west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Mississippi River. So this expands the frontier, pushes the French off, and it creates a progress where people are going to start trying to move farther west, expanding into the Appalachians and beyond. So the Americans saw this new land as kind of a land of opportunity. As we saw, the idea of the colonists coming over originally is they were able to own land, they were able to plot land, but once more and more people are there, there's less and less land. But the land to the west of the Appalachians, moving into like the Ohio Valley and those areas, hasn't been colonized yet. There are Indian tribes there, but as we've seen with the colonies before and the colonists, they weren't too worried about that. Continue pushing west, but the West kind of serves as a land of opportunity where you could own your own land, make your own way of life, that American dream. But the problem with this expansion is, as I mentioned, there are natives here already. And these natives aren't too excited about having white men, white families come in and take their land and push them further. And so being British subjects, the colonists, the British are obligated to protect them, but it becomes too expensive to protect the colonists from the Indians, from native attacks, because they're out on the frontier, and so that it becomes a problem of protection. And so what they British decided to do is limit expansion. And one of the main reasons they do this is because of Pontiac's rebellion. Pontiac was a Indian chief who led a loose confederation of Indian tribes. They're primarily in the Great Lakes region, in the Illinois country, the Ohio country, and they were dissatisfied with the British policy of letting white people, let colonists move into their land, and so they started a war against the colonists. And what this does is it eventually ends in like a military stalemate, but it forces changes in the British policy towards westward expansion. So with these problems in the Western Territory, King George III made the Proclamation of 1763, which basically said there was no expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. You can see the map here. This is drawn up as Indian country. That's left for the natives. The Appalachian Mountain is the end of the colonies. But you have to imagine that is upsetting to some colonists who are seeing that land as an opportunity to land for the American dream. So there's also the problem of the massive British debt, as I've said, 140 million pounds. And these are tax problems for the British Empire. They have to have money somewhere to pay this debt. And actually, during this time, British citizens are taxed 26 times the amount of Americans. So they're taxed hugely compared to the Americans. Americans, of course, saw this differently. They viewed it as an idea of the British Parliament passing decrees, passing laws, taxing the American colonies without any form of representation. They have no say in what Parliament does. They're on the other side of the ocean, so they do not think that they should have to support Britain financially. So you get to see that divide between the two ideas. But the view from the British side is obviously completely different. They view the taxes as justified. They came over, sent 10,000 troops to defend the colonies against the French and the Indians in the French-Indian War. The debt occurred during that conflict. So that was the cost of protecting Americans. And so why shouldn't the Americans have to pay for some of that? So to begin paying off this debt to the Americans, the British Parliament passed the Sugar Act of 1764. This was actually the first law that taxed the colonies directly. So it was the first law from Britain taxing the colonies directly, and not having the colonial delegations, which were subject to the British Crown, tax the people. And so the purpose of this tax was obviously to raise revenue, to generate revenue. Sugar was extremely popular. They would add a tax to every sale of sugar, as sugar continues to be popular to this day. And this tax actually cut the tax rate by 50%. It was the tax rate from the 1733 Molasses Act, which had been passed to regulate sugar trade in New England, was actually never enforced. So the British had kind of left the Americans again to do their own thing. They've never enforced the law, and so Parliament decided to create a tax. So the tax would have been from 6 pence under the Molasses Act to 3 pence. So it cuts the rate in 50%. And they thought that this was generous to the colonists, but what this did was really upset people who, particularly people producing sugar, because it's affecting their business. But they see this as Parliament overstepping their bounds, really enforcing taxes on them. But it wasn't until the Stamp Act of 1765 that the Americans were truly angered by a tax. So the Stamp Act taxed every piece of paper used by colonists. So this could be put on contracts, on newspapers, on playing cards, any kind of legal documents, anything that is traded as a piece of paper. They put a stamp on it, and that is part of a tax that has to be paid when you buy this paper. So this really upset. This affects a lot of different, it's not just sugar now. They are taxing paper throughout the colonies. So this act actually gets the Americans very upset. So here you can see an illustration of how much the Stamp Act would have increased the price of different articles in today's money, in 2019 dollars. So a diploma, a single parchment of paper that you would get for graduating high school or something along those lines would have gone up by $234.84. Two dice playing dice, a little packet of them would have gone on by $58.72. That almost been too much to buy dice. No one would buy them for that cost. And then a pack of playing cards would go up by $5.87. So you can see how this could really upset them. The increase of this money on just normal items. Well, obviously, like the rises of prices to items, as we saw, would really upset the Americans. It also really changed the colonists' idea of how they looked at Britain. They saw Britain now as an abusive bully who threatened their livelihood. And the idea became the famous chant of taxation without representation. The idea that Parliament could pass a tax to enforce on everyday items, and they don't have any say in who sits in Parliament. The colonists do not get to vote directly for the members of Parliament, but instead, what the British claim is that the Parliament and the King represent subjects throughout the entire empire, and that you have a virtual representation, that we are looking for your interest even though you have no say. And the Americans rejected this idea. They wanted a direct say in their government because they had had that in the colonies. So, as a revolt against the Stamp Act, you had certain groups who were fighting against it. One of these groups is the Sons of Liberty. This was a secret organization that was created in the 13 colonies to advance the rights of European colonists, not just British colonists, but all European colonists, to fight taxation of the British government. And it played a major role in most colonies in battling the Stamp Act, as we saw. The Stamp Act. So what you see here is they are pouring tea down the mouth of a tax collector. He's also tarred and feathered. They would cover people in tar and throw feathers all over them. One of the tax collectors, they would attack them. So they led protests throughout the colonies. And you see a similar thing here. This is a colonial revolt. So the Sons of Liberty would lead this kind of revolt. This is the tax collector. They're hanging him up here. And the whole town's looking at him. No one feels bad for him. He is the evil person. So this was a common scene throughout the colonies as a result of the Stamp Act. The colonies actually began to unite because of the Stamp Act. In 1765, 9 colonies came together and called for an end to the Stamp Act. This was known as the Stamp Act Congress, or the Congressional Congress of 1765. And so they all came together to work together, 9 colonies. And this is the first time they had really started to unite together with a common purpose. There was a group or groups known as the Committees of Correspondence. And these were kind of shadowy organizations behind the scenes that kind of coordinate a response between different colonies of how they would react to British taxes, to British rules. So they were deciding behind the scenes kind of what was happening, talking together. So begin working together as colonies. So it's not Virginia is separate from Maryland. They're talking about what to do together. And what they call for in this Congress are boycotts against the Stamp Act, directly attacking the people, but not just directly attacking people, but openly boycotting, not paying the stamp tax. As a result of these protests, as a result of these boycotts, Parliament in Great Britain passed the Declaratory Act of 1766. The Declaratory Act actually repealed the Stamp Act and lessened the Sugar Act, but it also asserted that it also asserted British right to tax the colonies whenever and however it wanted. So basically, the British are saying, we'll get rid of these, but we can do this. Like, we are letting you know that we have the ability to tax you whenever and however we want to do it. So having declared their right to tax the colonies, the Parliament passed the following year in 1767, passed the Townshend Acts. These taxed a variety of items, including glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. But the Americans had already learned just to boycott it, so most of them did not even pay the tax, and it only netted 295 pounds, so a very minuscule amount. So to protest the Townshend Acts, the Americans, the colonists, just would protest by not buying British tea. But in 1773, the Parliament passed what was known as the Tea Act, which actually allowed the British East India Company to sell tea from China without paying taxes in the Townshend Act. So the colonists actually saw this as a way around this. They were able to sell Chinese tea without paying the taxes that the Americans had been forced to pay. So on December 16th, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, and many of them dressed as Mohawk Indians, boarded ships of the British East India Company with Chinese tea and threw a lot of the tea into the Boston Harbor. They threw 342 chests, and this protest is famously known as the Boston Tea Party. So the protest against British taxes. Just another display of that. The Boston Tea Party, the Sons of Liberty, which challenged the Tea Act by dumping 45 tons, $4 million of tea into the harbor. They're just protesting this, and it became a famous act of defiance. So we've looked at two ways in which the colonists were upset with the expansion of British authority in the colonies. The limitation of westward expansion, the colonists saw as their right to move west to seek opportunity, and the implementation of taxes. They saw them being that the British were unfairly having taxation without representation. There's a third really important way too, is that a lot of the colonists believe that the Parliament was infringing on their civil liberties, on their God-given rights, as we saw with John Locke, their natural rights with the consent of the governed, these Enlightenment ideas. They believed that Parliament was actually violating these rights. And so the most famous statement about this can be seen in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So one of the ways that the colonists got around paying the sugar tax and paying some of the other taxes was smuggling goods around British authority, bringing them through ports at different times, or smuggling them in different kinds of containers, stuff like that. So what happened was the British passed the Rights of Assistance, which was an effort to stop smuggling, and it allowed the British to seize goods without a search warrant. So they didn't have to get any kind of authority to search vessels in the harbor, search warehouses, search things like that. They could go in at any time, any place they wanted to look for smuggled goods, so they could tax those goods. And this actually leads directly to what would become the Fourth Amendment of the Bill of Rights. So the colonists and the founding fathers would take these ideas and apply them to our amendments. So the Fourth Amendment is the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. This is where the idea of you have to have a warrant comes into our Constitution, was the rights of assistance. So also for things like smuggling, the British would try colonists in what were known as vice admiralty courts. These were courts completely run by the British, and they had a biased judge. So the judge would make a decision that was often usually against the colonists. So that actually leads directly to the amendments, the Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Amendments. So the Fifth Amendment is the protection of rights to life, liberty, and property. That's also the amendment that gives us the right against self-incrimination. If you've ever seen a court drama where someone pleads the Fifth Amendment. The Sixth Amendment is the rights of accused persons in criminal cases. It's basically saying if you're accused of a crime, you have a right to a jury. And then the Seventh Amendment is the right to a jury in a civil case against where if someone charges someone else with a crime, they are able to have a jury case. So a jury of their peers tries it, not a biased judge. So there are a lot of British soldiers in the colonies, many of them left over still here from the French and Indian War, but they didn't have large military bases like you would have today. They didn't have housing like you would have today. So what happens is the Parliament passes the Quartering Act of 1765, and this required that colonies that they'd have to house British soldiers in barracks provided by the colonies. If the barracks were too small to house all the soldiers, then localities would have to accommodate soldiers in local inns, either stables, ale houses, or even houses. So soldiers, what you can see here is a depiction of British soldiers, British redcoats, in a private residence, and these people are expected to not only house them but feed them. So these soldiers are coming in and basically coming into people's houses and saying, and that leads to our Third Amendment. The Third Amendment is basically the no quartering of soldiers. You don't have to house soldiers. That's a Third Amendment in the Bill of Rights. It's based on the idea that was created in the Quartering Act. So ideas like the Quartering Act and the charging of smugglers and all these taxes created more of a military presence in the colonies. So this is actually going to irritate and agitate the colonists even more. These military measures that the British are taking are going to make them feel like they're even under more control, and they're having their rights even violated to a further degree. Irritations with military rule and military presence in the colonies would come to head in the incident known as the Boston Massacre. Um, and so what happened here was there were a group of troops, 9 British troops, on King Street in Boston on March 5th, 1770. And the Americans violently challenged the troops. They were throwing rocks at them, yelling at them. Most of these people were drunk, and they came out with a club, and the British soldiers fired on the group. In this, 5 colonists died, but what this was really important for was that some leading patriots, such as Paul Revere and Samuel Adams, really jumped on this for propaganda purposes and started spreading this idea that the British are firing on us, that they're killing people in the colonies now, that this is tyranny. So this was kind of it was a propaganda movie. It was able to use, the Patriots could use this against the British. So another measure that increased the military presence of the British in the colonies was with the Intolerable Acts, which were passed by British Parliament in 1774, and they were a response to the Boston Tea Party, to the response to the colonists throwing $4 million of tea in the Boston Harbor. What they did was shut down the Boston Harbor. They enforced a martial law. So the military itself set the law in the streets, was basically the police, and could walk around doing what they have. And they severely threatened colonists. They would threaten colonists with ideas of insubordination. If colonists didn't agree to what they were doing, they were allowed to basically do what they want to do. So this is seen as a huge invasion of the civil liberties of the colonists, that they are enforcing martial law throughout Boston, shutting down the harbor, threatening colonists. So the Intolerable Acts really shocked Americans. This were the most severe measures by the British government, the British military on the colonists, on the Americans to date. So what this does is actually brings them together even more. The colonies unite for the first time. 12 of the 13 colonies, only Georgia did not attend, meet at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, between September 5th and October 26th, 1774, basically to talk about what is to be done about these Intolerable Acts, to come up with ideas, and they really unite for the first time is what you're seeing. So obviously through all of this, tensions are very high between the British military present, the British government, and the colonists. And so these tensions actually come to a head and spark at Lexington and Concord, which are in the province of Massachusetts Bay in the Massachusetts colony. So on April 19th, 1775, a group of Minutemen challenged British soldiers. Minutemen were militiamen. They were average men, farmers, artisans, etc., that could be armed, that were armed, had their guns, and they could be called on a minute. That's why they were known as that. So they could let a call that there was a need for defense. They could rise up and defend their town, defend their province, something like that. So what happens? They begin challenging British soldiers there, and we don't know what happened. We don't know who fired first, but either the Americans or the British fired, and it became known as the shot heard round the world. It was a skirmish. In that skirmish, in the fighting, 49 Americans died and 73 British soldiers died. So killed quite a few people. And so this tensions really sparked and really started the Revolutionary War. So as a result of all this tension, as a result of the skirmish at Lexington and Concord, there were calls for independence in the colonies. The most famous was probably Thomas Paine's pamphlet known as Common Sense that was published in 1776. In this pamphlet, Paine basically uses plain language, kind of a clear prose. So he's talking to the common man, and marshaled up some like moral and political arguments to encourage people to fight against the British system, against the British government. And then you also have Patrick Henry's famous quote that he made, "Give me liberty or give me death," basically saying like, this is the time. Give me freedom or kill us. Like, we are ready. So the fighting at Lexington and Concord leads to what's known as the Second Continental Congress, that actually started in 1775. In the May of 1775 in Philadelphia, 12 of the 13 colonies meet here. Georgia will actually endorse it as the 13th colony, so the 13 colonies come together by July of 1775. But it really isn't until 1776, the following year, that things begin to pick up steam. And this is where the colonies formalize the break with Great Britain. They decide that they are going to declare their independence. They write a Declaration of Independence. You see that the famous document that they sign on July 4th, 1776, declaring their independence, send it to King George, and they appointed George Washington commander of the Continental Army. So Washington had been a commander in the French and Indian War. They command him Continental Army. They know the British aren't going to handle this. So what they're doing is basically declaring independence and declaring war on Great Britain at the Second Continental Congress. So I know there's a lot of short-term causes building up towards the revolution, towards the Revolutionary War. But what we really have to think about when we look back at the years during 1763 to 1776, the Americans became united as a country. This was the first time that the colonies had gotten together, that their governments had gotten together, that their leaders had gotten together to have any form of like formal discussion, to work together at all. So you see that with the Stamp Act Congress, with the First Continental Congress, and finally with the Second Continental Congress. Americans also became aware of their difference from Great Britain. Before the French and Indian War, they really saw each other as the same. A lot of the colonists saw themselves as British, but as these things go farther and farther in the future, the military rule gets worse. Things happen. Americans begin to see themselves differently. They see themselves as different people from the British. And then finally, Americans embraced liberty. They embraced those Enlightenment ideas. They embraced the idea of like natural rights and the consent of the governed. And they came in on it through like ideas such as Thomas Paine's common sense, that it was their right to have their own government. And so all of these factors led to what would be the Declaration of Independence, the separation with Britain, and the Revolutionary War.